Michael Jensen, a rather haggard old man with a shovel in hand, a grave digger he was in a hallowed, haunted land. For 40 years, through sun, darkness, and storm, he buried the dead, his work the unfortunate norm. Since the early 1900s, he'd toil away, digging graves where corpses lay. But sometimes at night in the eerie cold, he'd hear strange sounds, whispers shockingly bold. The ground beneath him, it sometimes moaned, as if the earth itself had groaned. He'd shiver as the shadows crept, while underfoot the restless slept. While burying one in the moon's pale light, he'd hear what seemed like a muffled scream of fright. From beneath the soil, deep and low, came cries of anguish, soft and slow. He'd dig again with shaking hands and wonder what cursed these sacred lands. The casket lid, once nailed tight, he'd pry it open, pale with fright. Inside the corpse, now upside down, its face twisted in a ghastly frown. Its nails were torn, its eyes gouged out, its hair ripped free, twisted in doubt. These souls, it seemed, had met a worse fate, buried alive before it was too late. Michael would stare in silent dread at the horror of the once living dead. Some nights the heat would rise from below, a scorching flame that started slow. It would singe his skin, burn his hair, as if hell itself had claimed someone there. The ground would smolder, hiss, and steam, and Michael would stifle a tortured scream. He knew in that moment that hell had won, claiming a soul that could never run. The ghosts he'd see were twisted and wrong, mangled faces where they didn't belong. Accidents claimed them, crushed and burned. They came to him though he never yearned. A woman with skin charred black as coal whispered of torment, of losing her soul. A man with limbs bent, broken and curled, told of pain beyond this world. They floated above where they had died, their stories etched in their gruesome hide. Michael ignored their gory pleas, tried to focus on the dirt and trees. For decades he buried, dug, and prayed, and through it all his sanity swayed. But one thing he was always sure to know: these ghosts could never follow him home. They stayed within the cemetery gates, bound by curses and grisly fates. Yet every time they appeared at night, he'd feel their sorrow, sense their plight. They spoke of regret, of lives unlived, of horrors in death they were forced to relive. The afterlife, they said, was worse than before, a place of torment, filled with relentless pain and gore. And so, Michael kept digging day and night, haunted by screams that filled him with fright. He thanked God each time the day would end, that the cemetery was their only friend. But the heat, the flames, the muffled cries made Michael feel he'd never escape their eyes. For every grave dug in the cursed ground held horrors waiting to be found around. And though his home was a place of peace, in the cemetery, the dead never ceased. They whispered, moaned, and dragged their feet, waiting for the living they hoped to meet. Monty Brown, a man of the dirt, with a twisted grin and a heart of hurt. He wasn't born for the light of day, but for the shadows where corpses lay. A gravedigger by trade, but much more by night, a man of darkness hidden from sight. Since the mid-1900s, he toiled away, digging graves where the dead would stay. But Monty's secret was a gruesome thrill, for he robbed the dead, fed on the kill. He didn't just dig, he didn't just steal. Monty lived for the rot, for the dead that could feel. Reeking of death, his stench so foul, like a grave that's opened, a decaying howl. You could smell Monty coming, a stench of dread, the odor of corpses that had long been dead. His clothes were stained with dirt and gore, his skin tinged with rot from his morbid chore. By day he worked like a humble man, But by night, Monte had a sick plan. He'd pry open caskets with a glint in his eye and take whatever the dead left behind to die. Rings, watches, whatever they wore, Monty would pocket them, wanting more. But it wasn't just treasures that he sought. It was the bodies, the cold ones he caught. Men or women, it mattered not. Monty's twisted desires were boiling hot. He'd drag them from the earth with a sick grin, his filthy hands on cold, dead skin. In the darkness where no one could see, he indulged in acts of unspeakable depravity. He'd lay with the dead, like a lover in bloom, his sickest secrets hidden in the tomb. Then he'd return them, or sometimes not, leaving them to rot, forgotten in the plot. Monte would stumble home, soaked in the scent of the corpses with whom his sick nights were spent. His house, a shrine to his madness and hate, where death itself walked through the gate. The smell of decay lingered in his halls, with rotting bodies hung on the walls. Like trophies of a sickening hunt, Monte displayed them in a grotesque front. Heads mounted like game on a hunter's rack, their glassy eyes staring back. He'd peel their skin, their bones he'd carve into grotesque art, macabre and starved. He'd use their limbs for everyday things, a hand as a hook, a spine to hang rings. Their bones became tools, their flesh became cloth. Monty turned them into trophies of rot. In his bed, the dead would lie, mouths agape with lifeless eyes. Monty would lay with them through the night, whispering secrets of his sick delight. He dressed the corpses like dolls in bed, while their rotting flesh dripped, black and red. He skinned their faces for lampshades pale, hung their bodies on hooks like a ghastly tale. Their legs splayed wide, arms in poses, Monty arranged them in obscene proses. He'd boil their bones for broth, no lie. The house a shrine where the dead don't die. The booze numbed the horror in his brain, but soon Monte's madness became too plain. He grew sloppy, reckless with his prize, and one fateful night he met his demise. Caught digging in a grave, drunk and slow, Monty was taken by lawmen in tow. They followed the scent, the putrid trail, to his house where death's grip did prevail. When they entered, their faces turned pale, their guts churned with sickness, their resolve frail. The stench was unbearable, thick as the night. The scene they uncovered, a ghastly sight. Corpses hung like trophies on display, their rotting bodies in grim decay. Heads adorned the walls, their mouths agape, eyes hollow, twisted in gruesome shape. Monty had skinned their faces for fun, used their bones as forks, their skulls as guns. In his bed they found a fresh corpse laid, dressed in clothes that Monty had made. The man's body bloated and stiff, yet arranged as though Monty loved the riff. Beside him, a woman, half rotted away, Monty's lovers of death, decayed in dismay. On the walls, bodies nailed and skewed, their skin peeled back, their muscles chewed. Rib cages split like cracked old wood, their remains used as Monty saw fit, for good. There were bodies in chairs, dressed up nice, like they were sitting for tea, served cold as ice. Their fingers curled, their bones so dry, Monty's hell was a grotesque lullaby. In the kitchen, the horror grew worse, a boiling pot of bone broth, foul and perverse. Monty had stirred it with a cracked femur bone, while the meat from the corpse made its sickening tone. But the worst was the bedroom, where decay had slept, where Monte, with the dead, in madness crept. They found him lying in filth and grime, his mind lost to rot, to death, to crime. When they took him away, the whispers remained of the horrors inside Monte's brain. For the dead in that house will never be free, trapped in the walls for eternity.